Power does not forgive defiance. It studies it. What Judith and Baldwin built was never meant to last. It was tolerated because it was distant, allowed because it was useful, watched because it was growing. This is what happened after the church failed to stop them. Now the watching is over. Summons replace questions. Silence replaces tolerance. What once survived as exile is now measured as a threat. Power no longer waits to understand. It prepares to act. Baldwin rides toward a court that still believes it can define him. Judith remains on a coast that has learned to stand without permission. Between them lies a decision that cannot be shared, delayed, or undone. Because when authority finally moves, it does not ask who built the order. It asks who controls it. And this time, the answer will redraw borders. Power doesn't ask for permission. It moves quietly, decides quickly, and leaves consequences behind. What you're about to hear is not legend. It is history told without illusion. This is a historical power story. Baldwin reached the court in 867 under watch, not welcome. The hall was full, yet quiet. Familiar faces avoided his eyes. Authority prefers to look united when it plans to narrow space. He was not accused. He was thanked. Gratitude is often the final layer before control is applied. Charles spoke calmly. He praised the stability of the coast. He acknowledged Baldwin's effort. Then he reminded him gently where titles come from. Service, he said, must remain aligned. Alignment, he said, preserves peace. Baldwin listened without interruption. He understood the pattern: praise first, then limits. The Crown proposed adjustments, more oversight, clearer reporting, royal representatives stationed along the coast. Nothing sounded unreasonable alone. Together, they reduced him from builder to caretaker. Baldwin asked one question: who would command the defenses in an emergency? The hall paused. Charles answered carefully. Authority would decide as it always had. That answer revealed everything. The coast had been allowed to succeed, but not to decide. Success without control has become dangerous. Baldwin did not refuse. Refusal would have ended the discussion quickly. He requested time to consider the terms. Time was granted because authority believed the outcome was certain. When Baldwin left the hall, he knew the truth. He was being absorbed, not rewarded. If he accepted, Flanders would become another managed border. If he resisted, Judith would be exposed. The choice was no longer about power. It was about survival of what they had created. And survival would require a decision that courts never forgive easily. Baldwin did not answer immediately. Delay was his only shield. He remained at court under courtesy, which is another form of watchfulness. Servants listened. Doors closed softly. Messages moved without him. By 868, the terms were clear even without ink. Acceptance would mean security without authority. Refusal would mean danger without protection. Authority had narrowed the path until choice looked voluntary. Baldwin requested permission to return to the coast before deciding. The request appeared reasonable. It was granted with conditions. Escorts would accompany him partway. Reports would follow. When he left, he carried no orders and no guarantees. Only the knowledge that the Crown now expected obedience to arrive quietly. Judith sensed the shift before his return. Fewer letters reached her. Church envoys paused their visits. Silence thickened. Power withdraws conversation when it prepares consequences. When Baldwin returned, they spoke privately and briefly. There was no argument. Both understood the same truth. The coast could not survive divided command. In crisis, hesitation kills. Authority that arrives late but decides first destroys what it claims to protect. Judith spoke the words Baldwin had not. They must decide where danger lives, not inland, not at court, here. That choice did not announce rebellion. It announced separation. They did not send refusal. They sent compliance that preserved control. Reports were promised. Oversight was accepted in name, but command remained where walls stood and fires answered. It was careful defiance, almost invisible. And that is what made it dangerous. Because power forgives open resistance faster than quiet independence. The authorities noticed the delay. By late 868, reports from the coast stopped matching expectations. Patrols responded faster than royal schedules allowed. Decisions were made before permission arrived. Order existed without instruction. Courts call this irregularity. Power calls it warning. Charles did not confront Baldwin directly. Direct conflict creates martyrs. Instead, pressure moved sideways. Church voices returned, asking about obedience, hierarchy, and proper submission. Their questions carried the memory of excommunication without numbing it. Judith received them calmly. She answered with records, not promises, grain counts, defense rotations, names of commanders. Nothing suggested chaos. Everything suggested control. That unsettled them. A controlled frontier without constant oversight implied something dangerous. Loyalty rooted in function, not fear. Authority depends on fear lasting longer than competence. Messengers carried concern inland. Advisors warned that Baldwin's position was solidifying. Titles were becoming habits. Habits become rights if left unchallenged. Charles weighed options. Force would destroy trade and expose weakness. Removal would fracture the coast. Silence would allow permanence. He chose preparation. Orders were drafted but not sent. Allies were consulted quietly. Replacement candidates were discussed without names. Authority does not act until it believes the outcome is guaranteed. Judith sensed the shift before it surfaced. Preparation has a rhythm. Fewer questions, longer pauses, men speaking as if decisions already exist. She understood then that patience had ended. What came next would not test loyalty, it would test removal. And removal never arrives gently. The first sign was absence. In early 869, expected messengers did not arrive. Supplies approved months earlier were delayed without explanation. Church letters went unanswered. Silence replaced procedure. Baldwin recognized the tactic. Pressure applied indirectly tests resolve without revealing intent. If the coast faltered, authority would step in as rescuer. If it held, stronger measures would follow. He ordered adjustments quietly. Reserves were redistributed, patrol routes changed. Nothing appeared urgent. Calm preserves morale, panic invites intervention. Judith focused on visibility. She attended councils. She listened to disputes. She ensured decisions were recorded and shared. The order had to look ordinary. Extraordinary order provokes attention. Rumors spread anyway. Inland courts were said to be preparing a reassignment, a new count, a cleaner alignment, someone acceptable to authority and distant from the marriage that complicated everything. Names were not confirmed. That uncertainty was intentional. Baldwin refused to respond to the rumor. He waited for instruction that would force clarity. Until then, action remained local. Judith understood the danger of waiting too long. Replacement does not arrive. It arrives escorted. She advised preparation for arrival, not resistance. If removal came, it would come with law, not swords. Law requires witnesses. Witnesses shape outcomes. They prepared records, defense logs, supply routes, names of men who commanded because they were trusted, not appointed. If authority came to replace them, it would have to explain why. That explanation would matter. Because when power must explain, it has already lost control of the narrative. And narrative decides what survives the moment that follows. Authority arrived with law, not force. In mid-869, a royal delegation reached the coast carrying charters, witnesses, and calm certainty. No soldiers marched ahead of them. Soldiers would admit fear. Law pretends inevitability. The delegation announced review, not removal. They spoke of alignment, not punishment. They praised stability while questioning command. Each sentence reduced Baldwin's authority without nomming him directly. Baldwin received them formally. He offered records before they asked, defense logs, supply lists, testimony from villages. Nothing was hidden. Transparency was deliberate. Judith stood beside him, silent. Her presence reminded them that legitimacy did not come only from seals. It came from continuity. The coast recognized her before it recognized parchment. The delegation expected disorder. They found a procedure. They expected dependency. They found initiative. Each answer closed a path they had planned to use. Privately, they warned Baldwin that independence invites correction. Publicly, they thanked him for service. The message was clear. Compliance would be rewarded later. Resistance would be remembered immediately. Baldwin did not argue. He stated one condition. In emergencies, command must remain local. Delay costs lives. The delegation refused to commit. That refusal exposed intent. Authority wanted control without responsibility. When the delegation departed, they left nothing resolved, but they left something worse. Certainty that removal was now policy, not possibility. Judith understood the judgment forming beyond the marshes. The next move would not arrive as a review. It would arrive as a decision, without appeal remaining. Decisions traveled faster than law. By late 869, inland councils agreed without writing it down. Replacement would come. Authority would arrive complete, escorted by legitimacy and patience. The coast would be informed, not consulted. Baldwin felt the change before notice arrived. Orders elsewhere began to bypass him. Traders mentioned new names. Priests spoke carefully, as if rehearsing a future already chosen. Judith understood the window closing. Once a successor stands on the ground, the argument ends. Removal becomes maintenance. She urged preparation for permanence, not defense. They gathered the men who actually held the coast together. Not nobles, not envoys, watch leaders, supply keepers, bridge guards. Baldwin spoke plainly. If command shifted inland, response would slow. If response slowed, villages would burn. The men did not debate. They had seen it before. No oath was demanded, only continuity. Judith addressed the council last. She did not claim blood or blessing. She named outcomes. Who decided alarms, who fed families, who answered the fires. The answers were known already. When notice finally arrived, it was courteous. A new count would soon be introduced to ensure harmony. Baldwin was thanked for faithful service. Baldwin accepted the letter without reaction. Acceptance was not surrender, it was positioning. If authority wished to replace him, it would have to do so while the coast continued to function as before. And that reality would expose the true question. Who actually ruled here? The answer would decide everything next. The new count arrived in early 870. He came with papers, witnesses, and calm confidence. He did not come with understanding. Authority believed presence would replace habit. It often does. Here, it did not. Villages received him politely. Bells rang. Bread was offered. Orders were listened to. Then the coast returned to its rhythm. Fires answered Baldwin's signals. Patrols moved as before. Decisions flowed toward the man already trusted. The new count noticed this by the second day. He requested reports and received copies already sent elsewhere. He summoned commanders who arrived late, apologetic, and unchanged. Respect was shown. Control was not transferred. Judith met him publicly. She welcomed him as representative of the crown. She asked which defenses he wished to alter. He asked for time. Time was not available here. Raiders appeared that week, testing the marshes again. The new count requested guidance from inland advisors. Baldwin did not. Defenses moved immediately. The threat withdrew. The difference was visible. Villagers spoke quietly, not of loyalty but of speed, not of law but of survival. The authorities watched the order function without it. By the fifth day, the new count understood the truth. He held a title without command. Removing Baldwin would not transfer power, it would remove it. That night he wrote inland with care. He did not accuse, he explained. The coast already had a ruler, and replacing him would cost more than tolerating him ever had before now. The letter changed the tone inland. By mid-870, advisors stopped speaking of removal and began speaking of settlement. Authority had reached its limit without admitting it. Force would damage trade. Law would fail without compliance. Silence would allow permanence. Charles understood the position clearly now. The coast could not be ruled from a distance. It could only be ruled through the man already obeyed there. This was not a victory. It was concession shaped to look like an order. A revised charter was prepared, language softened, terms adjusted. Baldwin's role was clarified, not replaced. Command in emergencies was recognized. Oversight remained on paper. Reality was left untouched. Judith read the draft carefully. She noted what was not written. No mention of obedience beyond defense. No requirement of presence at court. No mechanism for replacement without cause. The absence mattered more than the words. Baldwin accepted the charter publicly. Acceptance closed the question. Authority prefers endings that appear chosen. The new count departed quietly, reassigned before his failure could be discussed. His presence was redefined as inspection, not attempt. History edits itself to preserve dignity. On the coast, nothing changed. Patrols moved, markets opened, fires answered. Judith understood the deeper shift. What began as exile had become recognition without surrender. The frontier had not been absorbed, it had been acknowledged. That acknowledgement carried weight. It would pass to heirs, it would survive rulers. Because authority had learned something it would not say aloud. This place no longer needed permission to exist. And places like that rarely return what they take from power. Stability changed the questions. By late 870, the coast was no longer discussed as a problem. It was discussed as a fact. Traders planned routes through it. Churches aligned calendars with its defenses. What had been temporary now shaped decisions elsewhere. Baldwin noticed the shift in tone before it appeared in law. Requests arrived asking for guidance, not permission. Neighboring lords asked how patrols were organized. They did not ask who approved them. Judith understood the significance. Influence had begun to move outward. That is how states form, not through declaration but through imitation. She remained careful. Expansion invites correction. She advised Baldwin to refuse alliances that required promises. Promises create obligation. Obligation invites oversight. Instead, they offered consistency. Anyone could trade. Anyone could pass safely if they followed the rules. The rules did not change. The authorities watched without interference. Interference would require explanation. Explanation would reveal weakness. Charles allowed the arrangement to stand. His attention moved to other threats. Power chooses its battles. This one no longer promised victory without cost. The people along the coast adapted fully now. Children grew up knowing one command structure. Memory settled. Memory outlasts charters. Judith recognized the final shift quietly. Their position no longer depended on Baldwin's presence alone. Others carried the procedure forward. Removal would no longer collapse order. That realization brought calm and risk. When power realizes it cannot easily reverse a decision, it either formalizes it or waits for death to solve it. Judith knew which one history preferred, and she understood that the next act would not be about survival. It would be about inheritance. Inheritance changes everything. By 871, questions of succession began to surface, unspoken but present. Authority tolerates strong men. It fears durable systems. Durability requires continuity. Baldwin prepared quietly. Command structures were documented. Roles were clarified. Nothing depended on improvisation alone anymore. That shift marked permanence. Judith's role became more visible, though never ceremonial. She advised on alliances by refusal. She had limited exposure. She ensured the coast remained predictable, not impressive. Predictability survives rulers. Church envoys returned, this time with clarity rather than warning. They asked about succession, legitimacy, and lawful inheritance. Judith answered without hesitation. Her anointing still mattered. Her marriage still stood. The questions were not challenges, they were confirmations. Charles received word of these inquiries and did not interfere. Interference now would reopen an issue he had already allowed to close. Power protects its earlier concessions by pretending they were intentional. Judith understood the quiet victory. They were no longer being measured against authority. They were being integrated into expectation. Expectation is how history accepts outcomes. That year passed without a crisis. No summons, no threats. Silence returned, but this time it was stable. Baldwin recognized the moment for what it was, not triumph, resolution. They had crossed from tolerated defiance into established rule. What remained was judgment. Not from kings or churches. From time to time. And time would decide whether what they built endured beyond them, or vanished the moment they no longer stood to defend it. The answer would not be spoken yet. Time tested what force could not. After 871, attention shifted from Baldwin to the structure beneath him. Authority watches foundations when it stops doubting the roof. If order survived without constant command, it was real. Baldwin reduced his visibility. He delegated openly. Watch leaders rotated without confusion. Markets functioned without decree. The coast no longer waited for instruction to act. Judith observed the deeper change. Loyalty had detached from the person and attached to the process. People followed routines because they worked, not because they were told to. That made the system harder to break. Church records began listing the coast as a region, not a problem. Traders referred to it by name rather than direction. Language settled. Language fixes reality. Judith advised restraint. No expansion. No display. Power that announces itself invites correction. Power that functions quietly becomes normal. Inland, no one challenged this normal. Charles ruled elsewhere. Other threats demanded attention. The coast required none. This absence of interference was not kindness. It was exhausting. Authority had learned that revisiting the question would cost more than leaving the answer alone. Baldwin sensed the moment clearly. What they had built no longer needed defense through action. It needed defense through continuity. Plans for succession were finalized without ceremony. Nothing was celebrated. Celebration invites memory. Memory invites challenges. Judith approved the final arrangements with one condition. The system must survive disagreement. If it failed under dispute, it would fail under inheritance. They tested it quietly. It was held. And when something holds without its creators pushing, history begins to close its hand around it. Stability invited comparison. By 872, neighboring regions began to feel uneven. Where Baldwin's coast held firm, others wavered. Raids found softer land. Trade routes shifted naturally, not by command but by preference. Preference is dangerous to authority. It reveals choice. Lords nearby sent observers, not soldiers. They watched patrols change at dusk. They noted how disputes were settled quickly without appeal to distant courts. They asked how long decisions took. The answer unsettled them. Decisions were made immediately. Judith understood the risk. Influence spreads faster than armies. If others copied this structure, the crown's reach would thin without a battle ever being fought. She advised Baldwin to share nothing formal. No manuals, no treaties. Observation could not be stopped. Instruction could. The authorities noticed the pattern as well. Reports arrived describing efficiency and local confidence. Words chosen carefully to avoid praise. Praise admits comparison. Charles did not intervene. Intervention now would require explanation. Explanation would reveal why this coast worked when others did not. Instead, the crown adjusted elsewhere. More officials, more oversight, more delay. The result was predictable. Comparison sharpened. Judith watched this with restraint. What they had built was becoming a reference point. Reference points shape future decisions even when unacknowledged. The danger now was visibility. Power does not destroy what works. It isolates it. If the coast became singular, it could be studied, limited, contained. If it became normal, it would spread unnoticed. Judith chose normal. No banners were raised. No claims were made. The coast continued unchanged. And that quiet persistence did more to reshape authority than any declaration ever could. Normality settled in quietly. By 873, the coast no longer felt new, even to those who remembered its chaos. Children learned routes without being taught. Markets opened on time. Patrols changed shifts without announcement. Order had become a habit. Habit is powerful. It removes the need for authority to prove itself. Baldwin watched this with care. He resisted the urge to refine further. Improvement attracts attention. Consistency dulls it. The coast did not become stronger by expansion, only by repetition. Judith understood the deeper consequence. Once people stop noticing order, they begin to rely on it. Reliance creates expectation. Expectation creates legitimacy that no charter can revoke. Church visits became infrequent and procedural. Priests asked fewer questions and recorded more confirmations. Baptisms, marriages, burials, life events passed through the system without disruption. That mattered more than decrees. Inland, the coast stopped appearing in reports. Silence returned, but this time it was genuine. The absence of a crisis removed the incentive to interfere. Authority looks where friction exists. Smooth systems escape attention. Judith warned against complacency. Stability invites one final test: succession. Many structures survive founders but collapse at transfer. The true measure would come when Baldwin stepped back. Preparations were adjusted again. Decision-making was distributed. No single command could halt response. That redundancy mattered. They did not announce readiness. They waited. Because power reveals itself most clearly not when challenged, but when it is no longer needed to be defended. The coast stood, and somewhere beyond it, history stopped asking whether this place would last. It began asking how long it already had. The measure came quietly. By 874, Baldwin began to withdraw without announcement. He attended fewer councils. He allowed others to speak first. Decisions still reached him, but they no longer waited for his approval to move forward. Nothing faltered. That mattered more than loyalty ever could. Judith watched carefully. This was the moment many systems failed. When presence fades, uncertainty usually enters. Here, it did not. Procedures continued. Watchfires answered. Disputes were resolved by those already trusted. The coast did not ask where Baldwin was. It knew what to do. Inland, the absence went unnoticed. No summons arrived. No concern was expressed. Authorities had stopped tracking individuals and started assuming continuity. That assumption is dangerous for power because it signals acceptance. Judith recognized the shift as final. What they had built had crossed from leadership to structure. Removing one figure would no longer change outcomes. That is when power truly loses leverage. Baldwin returned to councils only when necessary. His words carried weight, but they were no longer required. Influence had dispersed. That dispersion protected what they created. Church records began listing the county by name alone without explanation. No qualifiers, no reminders, it simply existed. Judith understood the significance of that language. Names without explanation are settled facts. She allowed herself no satisfaction. Satisfaction invites error. Instead, she confirmed succession again, not by decree, by repetition. The coast responded as expected. An expectation is the final seal history applies. What follows no longer needs permission. It only needs time. Time did not hurry. By 875, the coast moved with a confidence that no longer looked borrowed. Traders spoke of routes as if they had always existed. Villages planned seasons without waiting for warning. The order did not announce itself. It simply held. Baldwin watched this with restraint. He did not step aside fully. He stepped back just enough to see clearly. The measure was not whether people obeyed him. It was whether they acted without him. They did. Judith noticed how disputes changed shape. They no longer appealed to authority. They were negotiations within rules already known. When decisions were questioned, the question was not who decides but what works. That distinction mattered. Inland, the crown's attention drifted elsewhere. Crises demand presence. Stability does not. The coast had become unremarkable, and that was its strongest defense. Church records continued to mark baptisms and marriages under the same headings. No special notes, no reminders of origin. History prefers simplicity once conflict fades. Judith understood the risk that remained. Success can invite imitation. Imitation can invite correction, but correction requires urgency. There was none. She advised Baldwin to resist one final temptation: expansion. No new borders, no claims. What endures is what refuses to overreach. They held to that restraint. As seasons passed, memory softened. People forgot why this place had once been questioned. They remembered only that it worked. That forgetting was decisive. When history forgets the argument, it keeps the outcome. And the outcome here had settled into something firm, quiet, and no longer dependent on the will of those who first built it. Judgment does not arrive loudly. It arrives as acceptance. By 876, the coast no longer required defense in words or deeds. No court debated its existence. No bishop questioned its order. What once demanded explanation now passed without comment. Baldwin understood this moment clearly. Power had stopped resisting. Resistance requires energy. Energy had moved elsewhere. He reduced his presence further, not as retreat, but as proof. Proof that command no longer rested in one body. Proof that removal would change nothing. Judith watched the authorities' final concession unfold without ceremony. No charter announced permanence. No decree celebrated autonomy. Instead, silence settled fully. Silence is how power admits it has lost the ability to reverse something. Church records confirmed inheritance as routine. No objections. No clarifications. What had once required defense now required only documentation. Judith felt the weight of this more than Baldwin did. She had lived inside permission all her life. She recognized the rare moment when permission becomes irrelevant. This was not a victory. Victory invites memory. This was normalization. Normalization is irreversible. The coast had crossed the final threshold. It no longer stood because Baldwin commanded it or because Judith legitimized it. It stood because people expected it to stand. That expectation shaped behavior. Behavior shaped continuity. Continuity replaced argument. Judith reflected quietly on the path that led here, from crown to confinement, From exile to foundation, each attempt to control had shifted power instead of ending it. History does not reward intention. It rewards outcome. And the outcome here no longer needed defense. It simply remained. What remained now would pass forward, whether kings approved or not. By 877, the question was no longer whether Flanders would endure. It was who would remember how it began. Baldwin remained present but distant. Councils met without awaiting him. Orders moved through familiar paths. When disputes arose, they were settled by reference to practice, not command. Practice had become authority. Judith observed the final shift with precision. Her name appeared less in reports. That was a success. Legitimacy had detached from lineage and attached to function. What once required her presence now required only memory. Inland, no effort was made to revise this arrangement. Revision requires justification. There was none that did not reopen old failures. Power prefers settled outcomes to corrected ones. The coast responded to threats as it always had, quickly, locally, without ceremony. Each uneventful response deepened the assumption that this was normal. Normal does not invite challenge. Judith considered the cost. They had lost the ability to explain themselves. Explanation implies contingency. What existed now did not feel contingent. Time confirmed the transfer quietly, without proclamation, leaving authority dispersed, embedded, and resistant to reversal by any single will or future ruler alone. Baldwin spoke once more to the council, not as command but as recorded. He reminded them why procedures existed, not as a warning but as inheritance. They listened, not because he was counted, but because the system had taught them to. That was the final proof. Power had not been seized, it had been replaced. By 878, time began doing what authority could not. Baldwin aged quietly, not in weakness but in distance. He walked the coast less. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was to clarify, not to decide. Decisions no longer waited for him. Judith noticed how absence changed perception. People no longer asked where Baldwin was. They assumed continuity. Assumption is stronger than loyalty. Loyalty fades. Assumption persists. The system held under small strain. A delayed patrol. A dispute over grain. Each was resolved without appeal upward. No one thought to send riders inland. The habit of local resolution had replaced dependency. Church officials recorded successions without comment. They did not annotate history. They updated ledgers. That distinction mattered. History becomes permanent when it is no longer explained. Judith reflected on how rarely permanence announces itself. It arrives not through ceremony, but through repetition without resistance. The coast repeated itself daily. The authorities stopped interrupting. Baldwin understood his remaining task clearly, not to rule longer, but to leave nothing unfinished that required him. He reviewed records. He confirmed redundancies. He corrected nothing publicly. Correction invites attention. Judith supported this restraint. Power that fades slowly survives longer than power that ends abruptly. Their withdrawal was deliberate, almost invisible. When Baldwin finally missed a council session entirely, no one remarked on it. The meeting proceeded. Decisions were recorded. Fires answered at dusk. Judith watched from the edge of the hall and understood the verdict. The system no longer required its founders. History had closed the door behind them. By 879, memory began to thin. Not the memory of hardship, but the memory of origin. People remembered safety, not struggle. They remembered routine, not risk. The coast did not speak of exile or defiance. It spoke of seasons. Baldwin appears rarely now. When he did, he was treated with respect, not reliance. That difference mattered. Respect honors the past. Reliance binds the present. The present had moved on. Judith noticed how language changed. People no longer said Baldwin's men, they said the watch. They no longer said his orders, they said the rules. Ownership had dissolved into structure. Inland, nothing challenged this. No charters revised it. No councils questioned it. Authority does not reopen questions it cannot answer better than before. Judith understood the final cost of success. The story no longer belonged to them. It belonged to the place. Places keep what they need and forget the rest. She felt no bitterness. This was the outcome she had chosen when she refused silence. Power that lasts must outgrow its makers. Baldwin asked once if history would remember them correctly. Judith did not answer immediately. Accuracy is not history's concern. Continuity is. That night the coast held as it always had. Fires answered. Routes remained open. Disputes ended without appeal. Nothing required explanation. And when nothing requires explanation, judgment has already been passed. Only one chapter remained. Not of action, but of consequence. By 880, judgment no longer required witnesses. The coast stood without announcement. No orders traveled inland. No confirmations returned. What existed continued because it had learned how to continue. Baldwin did not disappear. He became unnecessary. That was the final transfer of power. Systems that depend on men collapse with them. Systems that survive men become states. Judith understood this more clearly than anyone. She had been crowned, confined, judged, erased, and returned in different forms. Each time, authority believed it had decided her fate. Each time, consequence moved elsewhere. She watched the coast function and recognized the verdict history had reached. Not on Baldwin, not on her, but on the system they had forced into existence. The crown had tried to control marriage and created defiance. The church had tried to correct obedience and created precedent. Exile had been meant to weaken and instead produce structure. No proclamation marked the moment Flanders became permanent. Permanence does not announce itself. It settles. It becomes expected. It stops being questioned. That is how power truly shifts. Judith did not seek legacy. Legacy seeks outcome. What endured here was not rebellion, romance, or bloodline. It was continuity born from refusal to submit quietly. When history later named this place, it did not name the arguments. It named the result. A frontier had become a state. Not because it was granted, but because it could no longer be taken back. Power believes it decides history. History records what power fails to stop. Judith was crowned to be controlled. Baldwin was exiled to be broken. Both assumptions were reasonable. Both were wrong. The lesson is quiet but absolute. Power loses its grip when it mistakes silence for submission. Judith never led armies. She refused to disappear. Baldwin never declared rebellion. He built continuity. Together, they revealed a truth older than crowns. Systems collapse not when attacked, but when people stop waiting for permission. Flanders was not founded by conquest. It was founded by endurance, repetition, and refusal to surrender decision-making to distant hands. This story does not end with victory. It ends with permanence. And permanence is the only judgment history never revises. Power always moves on. History decides who mattered. If this story stayed with you, there are others waiting. This is a historical power story. History rarely rewards the people who change it. If this story made you pause, there are more like it on the channel. New historical power stories are added regularly.